Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 140th deck and it's titled Gotta Go Fast. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was actually suggested to us by Powerful Milk 2794 over on Reddit. And that card is going to be Primal Forcemage. So Primal Forcemage is 2 and a green for a 2/2 Elf Shaman. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +3/+3 until the end of turn. So I figured there were really two major ways we could take this card, and that was probably with Flash, using it to block creatures, or with Haste, using it to attack. Now, being the natural Boros player at heart that I am, I decided we were going to go with the Haste option and attacking. So that means that this week, our commander is going to be helping us do that, because our commander is Ognis the Dragon's Lash. And Ognis is 1 and a hybrid red-black, a red, and then a hybrid red-green for a 3/3 legendary creature via Shino Warrior. They've got Haste, and whenever a creature you control with Haste attacks, create a tapped treasure token. So since we want our creatures to come in, get that boost from Primal Forcemage, and then attack right away because they've got that pump, we might as well also be ramping with it thanks to Ognis's ability. Now, it is important to note that the treasures do come in tapped, so we can, unfortunately, not use them the turn that they come in, but that's okay. We can still kind of make some good use out of them. So with all of that being said, let's take a look at some of the themes of this deck and figure out what exactly holds it all together. So the first piece, as you may have already guessed, is of course Haste. We want to make sure that our creatures are benefiting from things entering the battlefield on the turn that we play them. So that is where cards like Death Leaper Terror Weapon come in, which is 2 red-green for a 3/3 legendary creature, Tyrannid. It has Flash, it's got Haste, and it has Flesh Hooks, which says creatures you control that entered the battlefield this turn have double strike. So because Death Leaper itself has Flash, we can use this as a defense. We can flash in this 3/3 with double strike, but it also means that all of our Haste creatures are going to be attacking with double strike, which really increases the power of what we're doing. And if we can make sure that we're playing a ton of Haste creatures, we can make sure that we are getting these benefits, we can really start to advance our game plan very, very quickly. So that is theme number 1. And theme number 2 is going to be playing into Ognis's ability to make us some treasures, because we can use things like Vazi Keen Negotiator, which is 2 black, red, green for a 3/3 human advisor. She also, surprisingly, has Haste, and she can tap and target opponent creates X treasure tokens, where X is the number of treasure tokens you created this turn. Then, whenever an opponent casts a spell or activates an ability, if mana from a treasure was spent to cast it or activate it, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, then draw a card. So this is going to be useful in several ways. The main one is that, of course, we can just make a ton of treasures with Ognis, meaning we can give our opponents a ton of treasures. Now, that may not always be the best case scenario, but because if our opponents spend treasures to cast their spells and activate abilities, we get to put counters on things and draw cards, it's not the worst thing in the world. Plus, there's a good chance that there's enough treasures running around, someone's probably just gonna have treasures, and we can just kind of use Vazi without actually having to give our opponents any treasures with her, so a nice little trade-off there. And then moving into our final theme of the deck, and this one is going to be pumping our entire team. We need to make sure that we can have a giant attack at any given time, because even though all of our stuff has Haste, not a lot of it has Trample. And so that's where cards like Endray's Forerunners comes in, which is 5 green, green, green for a 7/7 boar, has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. And when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2, Vigilance, and Trample until the end of turn. We already have the Haste aspect covered, but if we can drop a huge creature that changes the combat math for our opponents and makes it so that we get a huge buff, we get Vigilance, we get Trample, and our team already has Haste, there's really not much our opponents can do to prepare for that, because they have no idea what's really going to be hitting them or how much power it's going to be. So being able to make sure that we can pump our team kind of out of nowhere is one of our biggest win conditions in this entire deck, And Endray's Forerunners is a great way to do that, but there are a bunch of other ways to do the exact same thing as well. So with all of that out of the way, let's move on to our key cards for this deck. And these are the cards that synergize very well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases actually wind up being win conditions on their own, or at least value pieces that push us toward those win conditions. The first key card that I would like to discuss is going to be Surrak and Goreclaw. So Surrak and Goreclaw, one of the few creatures in the deck that doesn't actually have haste, is 4 green for a 6/5 human bear, has trample. Other creatures you control have trample, which we've already talked about, very important. And whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until the end of turn. Since most of our stuff is going to have haste anyway, that's not super important, but being able to put a permanent counter on our stuff plus giving trample is absolutely massive in this deck. We have a ton of ways to get in for some kind of sneaky damage, but it's not going to do us any good if our opponents have blockers, so we need to make sure we have trample. And just kind of blanketing the field and saying everything has trample for as long as Surrak and Goreclaw is on the battlefield, plus we're still getting that additional little boost, that is absolutely perfect for what we're trying to do. So I definitely think Surrak and Goreclaw deserves a spot right here at the key cards and is probably one of the MVPs of the deck. Moving into our next key card, this is one of my personal favorites. This is Agent of the Iron Throne. Since we're making so many treasures, we might as well have a way to kill our opponents with non-combat damage, just in case we kind of get locked out of combat, and Agent of the Iron Throne is the way we're going to do that. Because Agent of the Iron Throne is 2 and a black for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have, whenever an artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. All we've got to do is sacrifice, say, 5 treasures. All of our opponents lose 5 life, and we can really get out of hand very quickly because we're making treasures every time we attack with our creatures that have haste. Then we're using those to ramp out more creatures with haste, which are making more treasures and draining our opponents just exponentially out of the game. So obviously, this is not the main win condition. We do want to be trying to win with combat damage, but as you may know, one of my least favorite cards in the entire game of Magic is Spore Frog, and there is a good chance that we just kind of get hit by a Spore Frog and we just can't do anything, and we are forced to use Agent of the Iron Throne to make sure that we can actually win the game. Ideally, that's not going to be the case, but you never know. So with that being said, let's move into our last key card, which is going to be Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon. And Samut is 1 green, red, for a 2/3 legendary creature, human warrior cleric. She has first strike, vigilance, and, most importantly, haste. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, if that creature entered the battlefield this turn, draw a card. This is one of the best haste payoffs in the entire deck, because not only are we ramping with our commander, we've got trample from Surrak and Goreclaw, but we're now drawing cards with Samut, because every single time a creature comes in, if we played it that turn, which means it has to have had haste to attack, we are going to be drawing cards. And that is absolutely huge, because that allows us to basically dump our hand on the battlefield, swing in, they all deal combat damage, and now we just refill our hand. So every single creature we have is essentially cycling itself away by drawing us a new card when it hits an opponent. So that is incredibly powerful and is really going to be one of the biggest win conditions in the entire deck, because we can't win the game without cards. Samut's going to make sure we have the cards we need. So those are all of our key cards, and the next thing we got to do for this deck tech is take a look at some cool interactions. These are things that are going to synergize very well with what we're trying to do, or in some cases might just be value engines on their own. The first cool interaction that I want to talk about is going to be between Charging Cinderhorn and Orabrask the Hidden. So Charging Cinderhorn is kind of an unspoken all-star in this deck. It is 3 and a red for a 4/2 elemental ox. It has haste, and at the beginning of each player's end step, if no creatures attacked this turn, put a fury counter on Charging Cinderhorn, then Charging Cinderhorn deals damage equal to the number of fury counters on it to that player. So we can essentially never take damage from charging Cinderhorn because we're always going to have something with haste. We can always make sure we're attacking, but our opponents might not be able to say the same. They might kind of get stuck in a situation where they have no creatures, or they're never going to be able to play creatures and then untap with them. And one of the real ways that we're going to make sure this works is with Urabrask the Hidden, which is 3 red for a 4/4 Phyrexian Praetor. Creatures you control have haste, and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So at this point, if we have Charging Cinderhorn and it's got even just a couple of Fury counters on it, we can make sure that our opponents aren't going to be able to attack at any given opportunity because their creatures are coming in tapped, so they can't attack even if they did have haste. And then we're going to have to pressure them so much that they may just have to leave those creatures back as blockers, because now all of our creatures have haste, including the ones that may not have had it in the first place, and it's going to be incredibly difficult for our opponents to do anything because they're taking damage from the Cinderhorn, or they're tapping out their creatures and then taking damage from our attacks. So that is absolutely perfect for what we're trying to do. And these two cards are great on their own in this deck, but combined they can really make a very difficult board state for our opponents to deal with. And then our next cool interaction that we got to talk about is going to be between Zira the Golden Sting and Glorybringer. So this might not look very apparent up front, and it really doesn't sound that powerful when you read through it, but this is a combination of cards that's going to draw us a card and make us a creature every other turn, unfortunately, because of the way that Glorybringer works with Exert. So Zira is 1 black, red, green for a 3/3 legendary creature insect assassin. She has flying and haste, and whenever she attacks, put an egg counter on another target creature without an egg counter on it. When that creature dies, if it has an egg counter on it, draw a card and create a 1/1 black insect creature token with flying. So we can partner that up with Glorybringer, which is 3 red for a 4/4 dragon. It's got flying and haste. You may exert Glorybringer as it attacks. When you do, it deals 4 damage to target non-dragon creature that an opponent controls. So you can kind of get the sense of what we're trying to do here. If we can actually attack with both of them at the same time, we can stack their triggers in a way that they both target the same creature, but Zira's ability can resolve first, putting an egg counter on it. Then Glorybringer can exert itself and do 4 damage to that creature, ideally killing it, because that's why we would be doing this. And then that creature would die. We immediately draw a card and make an insect creature token. Now, because of Exert, like I said, we can't do this every turn. We can only do it every other turn. But that's still a little bit more value than you might be able to get out of it normally if we can kind of keep triggering it. And we do have ways to untap creatures and get extra combat steps and all that stuff. So there is a chance we can do this multiple times a turn or even every turn. But at least, bare minimum, we're getting it every other turn, which is still pretty good. So those are our cool interactions. And of course, the last part of this deck tech is to move into the actual price of the deck and see how it looks from our $100 budget perspective. This week, we hit $84.33, which is not super expensive, but it's also not super cheap. We're kind of right at our budget limit, but we do still have some space to play with if we wanted to. In this case, though, our most expensive card in the entire deck is actually a card that I was a little surprised was as cheap as it was, as weird as that sounds, because that is Holga Relentless Rager. So because Holga was only ever printed in a secret lair, I did expect her to be a little bit more expensive than this, so I was very happy that I was able to include it in the deck, because I do think it does do a very good job with what it does. Because Holga is 4 red for a 4/6 human barbarian. She has haste, she must be blocked if able, and whenever she attacks, each creature you control attacking a player gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each creature that player controls. This doesn't seem super great, obviously, if we're against like a control strategy or someone who doesn't have any creatures, but as soon as our opponents start having any creatures, Holga starts pumping up the entire team a lot, and that is all we might need, combined with all of our haste, combined with all of our trample and our treasure production, to just kind of close out the game. So I think Holga is very strong, and I do think she deserves a spot in the deck. However, she is almost $7, so if you do need to trim a little bit off of the price, she would be a card to cut to make it a little bit cheaper. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to slot into the deck and a card to take out to, maybe increase the budget a little bit, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So this week, the card that I would recommend putting in for an out-of-the-budget upgrade is actually Displaced Dinosaurs, and the card I would take out is the Balrog of Moria. And this looks a little bit strange up front because Displaced Dinosaurs doesn't actually have haste, and it actually has nothing to do with haste. It's a 7 mana, so 5 green, 7/7 dinosaur that says as a historic permanent enters the battlefield under your control, it becomes a 7/7 dinosaur creature in addition to its other types. So like I said, that's nothing to do with haste. But what it does do is it now turns all the treasures that we're producing into 7/7 dinosaurs. And we do have a ton of ways in the deck, we mentioned Urabrask earlier, that can give all of our creatures haste. So now we make a ton of 7/7s when we attack with Ognis. All those creatures untap on our next turn. They technically have haste because of something like Urabrask. They attack, they make more treasures, which are more dinosaurs, and this can really get out of hand very, very quickly because it doesn't take that many 7/7s to close out a game, especially if they have trample. So that is why I think it deserves a spot in our deck. It is unfortunately almost $16, so it is massively expensive for what we're trying to do. But if you did want to put it in, I would recommend taking out actually another Universes Beyond card in the Balrog of Moria, because this one, for the same price, it's 7 mana, 4 black, and red, you get an 8/8 with trample and haste, that when it dies you may exile it, and then exile up to 1 target creature each opponent controls, which is decent. It also has cycling for 3 and a red. When you cycle it, you make 2 treasures, which is also very good, but unfortunately it just doesn't quite do as much as we were hoping. It doesn't have any attack triggers, it doesn't have any combat damage triggers. It really only does something when it dies or when it's cycled, which is not what we want to be hoping for with our creatures. We would really want them to be doing something other than dying to be able to be useful. So I do think the Balrog is very sweet, and it definitely could go in the deck. I'm not saying it's the worst card in the world, but I think if you had a choice between these two and budget wasn't an option, or I suppose not an option, if budget wasn't an issue, then I would recommend putting in Displaced Dinosaurs and taking out the Balrog of Moria. Now, with all of that being said, we do have to see how this deck performs in a game, but before we get to that, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. We have all of our social media accounts up on the screen. If you're interested in any point in sending us any messages, asking any questions, or suggesting cards for the channel, just like our current one is for this deck, these are all great ways you can do it. You can find us on Twitter, you can find us on Reddit, you can send us an email. And then if you're looking to support us a little bit more directly, other than, of course, just liking the video and subscribing to the channel, which is always amazing, and thank you so much to everyone who's already done that, you can also find us over on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member. And by getting in on either of those two things, you get the guarantee from me that any of your suggestions will be turned into videos eventually. You'll also get a ton of other great benefits, like a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also participate in some of the games. So if you want to be on the channel, that's a great way to do it. Plus, you'll also get a card sent to you every week. Well, not every week. You'll get one of the random cards sent to you every month. My apologies. And then you'll also get access to the deck lists a week early. And then a bunch of other cool stuff, which honestly, probably the biggest thing there is either the Discord channel or the ability to get your card always chosen. So if you would like to join the amazing patrons and channel members, you can find everyone listed below. They are William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Huey, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. Of course, thank you to everyone who watches the videos, everyone who likes and subscribes and comments and all of that stuff. I really do appreciate all of it. You make this so entertaining and so much fun to do. So with all of that being said, I've done enough rambling. Let's get into our game. So this week, we are going to be joined by 3 opponents playing a variety of decks, and in this case we have Bilal playing Marin of Clan Nel Toth, Josh, who is new to the channel, first time showing up, playing Zerzoth Chaos Rider, And then Luke playing Masumaro First to Live. So Bilal's Marin deck, I have actually played this deck quite a few times. It is your traditional Marin deck. It just wants to sacrifice creatures and bring them back and get a ton of value. And I'll be honest, I know I joked about Spore Frog earlier. I would not put it past Bilal to actually have a Spore Frog in this deck because, one, it's very good with Marin, but also he knows how much I hate Spore Frog, so I imagine if he can get the chance to play it, he will. So hopefully we can get our Agent of the Iron Throne out and we can kind of get around that, but we will see. Moving on to Josh and his Zerzoth deck. This is a deck that I am very much looking forward to playing against. Zerzoth is one of my personal favorite commanders, so I always love seeing Zerzoth out in the wild. And Josh is a good friend of mine that for the longest time I didn't actually know that he played Magic, so it's very cool to be able to sit down and play a game with him, so I am looking forward to that as well. And of course, like I mentioned, Zerzoth, absolutely great. Just play devils, draw cards, make a ton of value, do a ton of damage, so very, very excited for that. Definitely my kind of play style. And then last but not least, we have Luke bringing Masumaro. This is a deck that we've seen a couple of times on this channel already. This is a hand size matters in mono green, which is a super cool strategy because you don't see that very often. So he really just wants to play as many creatures that get super big when he draws cards. He wants to draw a ton of cards and then just kind of repeat that cycle of drawing cards because you have a big creature and then you have a bigger creature because you drew more cards and so on and so on. And eventually he's going to use that to try to knock out each of his opponents. So also very much looking forward to that deck. It's always a ton of fun to play whenever it comes up. But those are all of our opponents for this week. Let me know down in the comments which of these opponents might be the toughest for our deck to take on. And then I hope you enjoy the game. I know I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Josh, and then Luke. On my first turn, I play a mountain. Bilal plays a forest. Josh plays a mountain. Luke plays a forest, then casts a Soul Ring, and then also casts Emerald Medallion, making his green spells cost 1 less to cast. I play a mountain. Bilal plays a High Market and casts Sakura Tribe Elder. Josh plays a mountain and casts Soul Ring, then casts his commander Zerzoth Chaos Rider, letting him make a 1/1 Devil token whenever an opponent draws their first card when it's not their turn, and also lets himself and defending player draw a card and discard a card at random whenever he attacks them with a Devil. Luke plays a forest and casts Morrow, which has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in Luke's hand. Unfortunately, on my turn, I miss my third land drop, discard to hand size and pass, while Bilal sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then on his turn, he plays a Nurturing Peatland and casts his commander, Marin of Clan Nel Toth, letting him get an experience counter whenever one of his creatures dies, and letting him put a creature from his graveyard into his hand in his end step, or put it into play if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of experience counters he has. This turn, he's able to return Sakura Tribe Elder to his hand. Josh plays a mountain, casts Ruby Medallion, making his red spells cost 1 less to cast, then attacks me for 2 with Zerzoth, letting us both draw a card and then discard a card at random. Then, since I drew a card on his turn, he makes a Devil token. Second main phase, he casts Pain Distributor, letting each player make a treasure token whenever they cast their first spell each turn, and doing 1 damage to an opponent whenever an artifact goes to their graveyard. On Luke's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking Bilal for 5 with Morrow. Then, in his second main phase, he plays a Tyrite Sanctum and casts Realm Seekers, which enters with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the number of cards in all players' hands, which is 21. Then he can also pay 3 and remove a counter from the Seekers to search his library for a basic land and put it into his hand. Unfortunately, I once again miss my land drop, discarding the hand size and passing. Bilal recasts Sakura Tribe Elder, making a treasure, then casts Graph Reaver, and casts Entomb, searching his library for a card, in this case Spore Frog, putting it into his graveyard. He then sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped and getting an experience counter, and this lets him move to his end step and put Spore Frog from his graveyard into play. Josh cast Witty Roastmaster, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control, also making a treasure. He then cast Cursed Mirror, having it enter as a copy of Witty Roastmaster, doing 1 damage to each opponent. After that, he cast Magus of the Wheel, doing 2 damage to each opponent. He moves to combat, attacking me for 2 with Zerzoth, Bilal for 1 with a Devil Token, and Luke for 2 with Pain Distributor. This draws everyone a card, and we all discard a card at random, making Josh 3 more Devil Tokens and doing 6 more damage to each of his opponents. On Luke's turn, he casts Green Sun Zenith for X equals 4, making a treasure and searching his library for a creature, mana value 4 or less, putting it into play. This gets him Nylea, God of the Hunt, giving his creatures trample, then he shuffles Green Sun Zenith back into his library, and he moves to combat, attacking Josh for 21 with Realm Seekers. On my turn, I play a Swamp and cast Chaos Dragon, making a treasure. Then, when I go to combat, each player rolls a d20, and the Chaos Dragon has to attack, but can't attack whoever rolled the highest. Since Luke rolls a 20, I attack Josh for 4. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Graved Pact, making a treasure and making each opponent sacrifice a creature whenever one of his creatures dies. Then he uses High Market to sacrifice Graph Reaver, gaining a life and an experience counter, making each opponent sacrifice a creature as well. This kills my Chaos Dragon, one of Josh's Devil Tokens, doing 1 damage to Bilal when it dies, and Luke's Morrow. In his end step, Bilal brings Sakura Tribe Elder from his graveyard back into the battlefield with Marin's ability. On Josh's turn, he attacks Luke for 2 with Pain Distributor, me for 2 with Zerzoth, and Bilal for 1 with a Devil Token. We all draw a card and discard a card, then Josh gets to make 3 more Devil Tokens, doing 3 more damage to each opponent. In his second main phase, he also cast Descent of the Dragons, destroying all 6 of his Devil Tokens and Luke's Realm Seekers, replacing them with 4/4 Dragon Tokens. This does 5 damage to Bilal and 1 to Spore Frog, killing it when the Devil dies, and 5 damage to each opponent when the dragons enter the battlefield, plus making Josh a treasure token. Before the Realm Seekers dies though, Luke activates the ability to remove a counter from it and search his library for a land, putting it into his hand. Finally, since Bilal's Spore Frog dies, he triggers Grave Pact, making Josh sacrifice Pain Distributor. On Luke's turn, he plays a Blast Zone and casts Wood Elves, searching his library for a forest, putting into play tapped, and in response, Bilal sacrifices his Sakura Tribe Elder, searching his library for a basic land, putting into play tapped, but also making each opponent sacrifice a creature, killing one of Josh's dragons and Luke's dragon. Once that's resolved, Luke casts Multani Morrow Sorcerer, which has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in all players' hands. On my turn, I cast Life of the Party, making a copy of it under each opponent's control, except their copies are goated. Then it has Haste, First Strike, Trample, and +X+O when it attacks, where X is the number of creatures you control. When Josh's copy enter, we all take 1. On Bilal's turn, he casts Gravebreaker Lamia, searching his library for a card, in this case Witherbloom Apprentice, putting it into his graveyard. He then attacks Josh for 3 with his Life of the Party, and in his second main phase, he sacrifices Life of the Party with High Market, gaining a life, making each opponent sacrifice a creature, killing my Life of the Party, Luke's Life of the Party, and one of Josh's dragons. Bilal then casts Sylvan Library, and in his end step, he returns Spore Frog from his graveyard to the battlefield. On Josh's turn, he casts Mechanized Warfare, letting his red and artifact sources deal an extra damage, and in response, Bilal sacrifices Spore Frog, preventing all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, also making each opponent sacrifice a creature. Josh then blitzes in Mayhem Patrol, doing 2 damage to each opponent, and sacrifices Magus of the Wheel, making each player discard their hands and draw 7 new cards. This triggers Zerzoth, making Josh 3 Devil Tokens, doing 6 damage to each of his opponents, knocking Bilal out of the game. He then plays a Mountain and casts Gibbering Fiend, doing 4 damage to each opponent when it enters thanks to its own ability and the Witty Roastmaster. Since the Life of the Party is goated, he does have to attack Luke with it, even though it does no damage thanks to Spore Frog. In Luke's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from the Gibbering Fiend since Josh has Delirium. Then he plays a Forest and casts Fungal Sprouting, making 19 1/1 Saproling tokens since he controls a creature with 19 power. He also cast Bane of Progress, destroying all artifact and enchantments when it enters the battlefield, getting 6 +1/+1 counters on it since it destroyed 6 things. He moves to combat, attacking Josh for 22 with Nylea and Multani, and Josh blocks as much damage as he can with his dragons and Gibbering Fiend, only taking 5 damage but killing all of his creatures. On my turn, I play a Cinderglade and cast Starscream Seeker Leader, moving to combat, attacking Josh for 2 with Starscream, giving him the Monarchy. On Josh's turn, he casts Perforos, God of the Forge, doing 2 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control. This means he just has to attack Luke and I, triggering Zerzoth twice to create 2 devils, doing 4 damage to each opponent, knocking us both out, and winning Josh the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Unfortunately, we got a little bit unlucky with our card draw. We only had 2 lands, and I kept that hand because it had a 3-mana rock in it, and we just never quite got there. And then eventually, once we did draw the land because of Zerzoth, I had to discard the mana rock, so not quite our game. But I do think that we still got to see some of the power of the deck. We got very unlucky with, well, with the lands, of course, but also with the fact that there was a Grave Pact on the field with a Marin deck, because we kept playing just one big, beefy creature every single turn and had to sacrifice it, which is not where you really want to be. But overall, still very cool. Definitely a lot of fun to play. This is a deck that I might actually just kind of hang on to for a little bit, test it out a little bit more, because I really like the style, and just playing hasty creatures is always a ton of fun. So moving on, though, around the table, getting to Bilal. Definitely controlled most of the game, and honestly, as weird as it is, if there weren't the devils being able to do non-combat damage, I do think Bilal could have won that game, being able to infinitely loop Spore Frog, which I told you it was going to happen. I can sense the Spore Frog. I just know it. But the Spore Frog being able to infinitely loop in and out of the graveyard really shut down Luke and I sitting at the table, because we were almost entirely combat focused. And then Josh, while still technically being combat focused, wasn't as concerned with it, because he still dealt that non-combat damage with his devils when they died or when they entered the battlefield because of the witty Roastmaster. So a very cool showing by Bilal, and a very cool showing by Josh as well, our winner. Definitely a sweet Zerzoth game. Being able to see kind of the synergies between devils entering the battlefield and dying, and then also attacking, really showed just how much damage Zerzoth could do at any given time. And this has really made me want to tweak my own Zerzoth deck, so definitely looking forward to that. And then finally, of course, Luke's Masumaro deck. It didn't unfortunately get there, but it came very, very close. I think on the last turn he mentioned that if he'd had 1 more mana, or if he'd had his commander in play instead of Multani, he could have actually taken Josh out of the game, because he could have pumped up his commander, but unfortunately couldn't pump up Multani because Multani had Shroud. So a very unique interaction, and he did actually mention that Multani used to be the commander of that deck, and then he swapped it out for Masumaro because he wanted to be able to target his commander. So it was kind of interesting to see that decision kind of come back to haunt him a little bit. But overall, very, very cool game. I was very happy with how things went, and even though it didn't quite go our way, maybe it will next time. So I hope you all enjoyed the game. Let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you think should be in our deck that aren't, or maybe cards that you think are in the deck and shouldn't be. I would love to hear arguments for either of them. But other than that, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.